Well, I'm delighted to be here with Paul Shackel, who is the chair of the department at the University, or the Department of Anthropology at the University of Maryland. And I would like to just have you start by telling a little bit about how you got into anthropology and the road you've taken.
Yeah. So when I was growing up, my folks are from an immigrant background, and they were always key that I get the union card and that I get a good job in the union, and they always stressed skills. And I started my academic career, my college career, thinking about getting a business degree or going into accounting, and I didn't do too well at that. So I had to rethink that course, and I went to a community college, and I spent a few semesters there at a community college, and I had this wonderful anthropology professor, and I thought to myself, wow, if I was going to work for 40 or 50 hours a week, I'd want to do something that I really like doing. And so I took every class I could on the community college level related to anthropology, and I asked the professor for any other opportunities that I could do in anthropology. And he told me about the Foundation for Illinois Archaeology and the archaeology program out there. And I said, sure, what the heck? And I went out there. It was a 1-week field school for adults, and I did the archaeology experience, and I said, this is what I want to do. So the following year, I signed up for a field school with the Foundation for Illinois Archaeology, which was being run through Northwestern University, and Jane Dykstra was the director of the program at the time, and I think Stuart Striever was moving out of the program at about that time. He started up the Crow Canyon project afterwards, and I just had a blast. It was just a great time doing archaeology in Illinois, and it just started me in a very different path, and I started thinking about archaeology in a very different way, and thinking about archaeology as a career path. And what's interesting is that my folks, who several years before were thinking about a union card and skills, were very supportive in what I was doing, and they said, sure, if that's something that you enjoy, we'll support that and do it. And so that's how I started my career in archaeology.
And you've done a lot of community-based work over the years, and I know some of that started by happenstance, but talk a little bit about your particular perspective on that.
On community, yeah.
Sure.
So my dissertation program was working in Annapolis and working with Mark Leone, who was one of the key people in creating public archaeology and popularizing public archaeology. I mean, there's other key figures who were doing it too at that time, and Mark Leone was doing it in historical archaeology. It was also going on in Alexandria, and of course Stuart Striever was bringing in the public to do archaeology. But I was very fortunate to work on that project, and the goal of that project was to bring the public into the archaeology. For a very long time through the history of American archaeology, the public was not wanted on archaeology sites, and Mark was very adamant about bringing people on site and interpreting the site to the public, and to such an extreme that he brought in directors to come in, play directors to come in and direct us at the archaeology site. So it became a performance, and we had scripts, and we would interpret those scripts and talk to the public about the archaeology. And there was always a theme, and there was always a message, and that became very important. And the message is tend to be very relevant. The messages were often about capitalism and critiquing capitalism, which was very edgy at the time, and people came to the archaeology sites, and sometimes hundreds of people a day would come to the archaeology sites. So that sort of laid the foundation for what I saw was possible in community engagement. And then I went to Harpers Ferry, and it was a little bit more difficult to do community work there. But we were able to talk to the community about the archaeology. A lot of people came through Harpers Ferry National Historical Park, and one of the things that I was able to do with the staff that I have was to prepare them, very much like Mark Leone prepared us in Annapolis, with messages. And so when people came to Harpers Ferry, the staff would get up out of the test unit and they would have a message about what we were doing at Harpers Ferry. And at that time, we were working on a lot of issues related to the early industrialization. So there too, we were able to continue that critique of early capitalism and how it impacted people and lives and in even the landscapes of Harpers Ferry. And from there, my next major project was at New Philadelphia, which is in Western Illinois, which was a unique project where we partnered with the University of Maryland partnered with the University of Illinois, the Illinois State Museum, and the Army Corps of Engineers, and we were able to pull off this amazing project working with the local community. And we started a dialogue very early with the community, and we began to talk to the community about what they wanted to know about New Philadelphia. And so we came into the project thinking about specific questions related to the lifeways of people and how they survived in diet and consumption and so forth. And after talking to the descendant community, they were very adamant about the message that the archaeology was going to create for New Philadelphia. And a lot of the folks there started to talk about freedom, that New Philadelphia, which was a town founded by an African American, was about freedom. And that became the basis for a lot of our archaeology and our interpretation for that project. And the freedom became a major theme in the National Register nomination for New Philadelphia, for the National Historic Landmarks recognition for New Philadelphia. So New Philadelphia was this really interesting project that was really easy to see how it changed over time and how community influenced our questions in the archaeology at New Philadelphia. And now, more recently, I'm working in northeastern Pennsylvania. And in northeastern Pennsylvania, the communities there are facing a crisis. And the crisis is that the community is changing dramatically. And in 2000, about 3 or 4% of the community was Latino. And today it's about 43% of the community is Latino. And so a lot of the white community feels overrun, and they feel like a lot of their traditions are no longer in place. The downtown is not the same anymore. And so we're trying to base our archaeology looking at immigration. So at first we started to create a program. We looked at historic immigration, where we were looking at Slavic and Italians coming into the community in the 1880s and 1890s. And we were looking at issues of race and racism and how they were discriminated against, and how people wrote derogatory comments about the new immigrants because they spoke a different language, because they dressed differently, because they celebrated different customs. And what we found while working in northeastern Pennsylvania is that we hear the same things with the new immigrants today. The Latinos are coming in and they're speaking a different language and they have different customs, and it's not the same customs that they've been celebrating for generations. So what we're trying to do is a lot of outreach to the communities and to think about northeastern Pennsylvania as not just about Italian and Slavic immigration, but thinking about immigration as a whole and trying to create this bonding mechanism between the new immigrant as well as the descendants of the older immigrants. And we're trying to create some common understanding because the new immigrant is facing a lot of the same obstacles as the older immigrant did. And so one of the things we're doing is we're recruiting students, Latino students, by working with different organizations, and we're bringing the Latino students on the archaeology dig. So we have college students working at the site for 6 weeks. The high school students come in during the 4th week. The college students then mentor the high school students, and the mentoring goes beyond just mentoring about archaeology, but it's about mentoring with everyday life skills and thinking about higher education in a lot of different ways. And so it's a really interesting endeavor because the college students are so close to their age, and yet they have that college experience. And the high school students actually pay attention to and listen to the college students, probably pay more attention to them than they would with me. And the mentoring is not just about archaeology, but it's about doing well in high school so that they could have good school records, so that they could get into good colleges. The conversations are also about paying attention to SAT scores because they're really important to get into colleges and finding scholarships so that they could better themselves and better themselves so they could help better their community when they come back to Hazleton, or this could be their ticket to go somewhere else if they want to. So through my career, I've seen a big change in the way people see community and community archaeology or public archaeology as a whole, from it being performance to being engagement, and to studying a group to working with a group, and so that's sort of interesting, and seeing the change in all this, and sometimes it's a lot of fun. Sometimes there's a lot of anguish because you're working with communities, plural, you're working with many communities, and oftentimes there's not one agreement about how to approach a problem or a subject, and so there's often a lot of dialogue, and with that dialogue sometimes a lot of angst, and the thing that we need to keep in mind, it's about patience and trying to work through a lot of these issues. So it's been an interesting ride.
Do you find that your students sort of naturally fall into, or they naturally have this ability to work with the younger students, or how do you mentor them, and how have you seen that change maybe over time as you've been teaching a couple generations of students, perhaps?
Well, when the students come into the graduate program and when they're working with me or some of the other archaeologists in the department, they see working with communities as an important part of archaeology. They don't see it as deviating or changing. I mean, this is the way it's done, and at the University of Maryland, this is the way we do it. And then when the students end up talking to folks in other universities, they say, "Oh, this is kind of interesting," unique or different. The for the most part, the students take to it pretty easily, and so it's not a change in discourse for them. They're being put into the situation immediately, and they see that as an important part of their discipline and their training in archaeology, and it's, I think, an incredible success that our students really see this as an important part of their training. In fact, I don't even think they feel like they're being trained. I mean, they just feel like this is a part of it, and this is part of their duties, and working with people and working with communities is very much a part of archaeology, and it should be. I mean, because we are working with communities for the most part.
And where do your students end up after they leave you? What kinds of work do they do?
Well, some students on the master's level end up going into PhD programs, and they're now teaching at some universities. Some of our recent PhD students are now in applied fields, and some of our students end up working for the National Park Service. And some are now working for nonprofit groups. So in most cases, they're working in a public sense or in a public arena. And so their training and their work during their master's or their PhD work is paying off, I think, as far as their jobs. I think a lot of our students get hired because they do work with people and they are trained to work in the public. More and more archaeology is about public, and it's not just about telling the story, but it's working with communities for a goal, to reach a goal. So the majority of our students are in applied fields. They work in applied fields, and by working in applied fields, they're helping to change the discourse about what archaeology is about, and I'm very pleased with that.
And talk a little bit about the relationship of archaeology and heritage, and I know you work collaboratively with faculty from a number of departments, in part through the center. So maybe just talk about that interdisciplinary work a little bit.
Yeah, so it's important to realize, especially when you're working with communities, that you just can't rely on archaeology itself, and it's about using other disciplines or even other techniques to work with communities. And so it's important to think about how archaeology can work with historic preservation. It's important to think about how archaeology can work with American studies or with public history. And it's often these collaborative projects that really go a lot further when you start working in an interdisciplinary fashion. And around the University of Maryland, what's interesting is around the University of Maryland, there are people of 93 different nationalities within a 3-mile radius. And so reaching these people and thinking about how you can do heritage programming and use heritage to the benefit of these different communities is really interesting and sometimes a challenge. And so we've been working in these different communities around the University of Maryland, doing archaeology, doing oral histories, trying to create a sense of place. So some of these communities have been devastated with urban renewal, devastated with the construction of the metro, where the metro has divided a community, and it's often the poorer African American communities that get impacted in a lot of these situations. So it's working with the different disciplines where the University of Maryland has held classes in these communities, where they help to revitalize the sense of heritage in these communities. Thinking about what's important in these communities becomes really important. So in one instance, we had members of the African American community from this one location close to College Park come to us, and they said, we want to figure out our heritage. We need some heritage programs. We want to get a better sense of our community and revitalize our community. And my first instance was to think about the impact of urban renewal, and I thought, and we had a discussion, can we do a program that emphasizes race and racism in the community? And the community leaders said no. They said, what we really want to do is emphasize education and the history of education in our community. That's what's really important to us. And so we had a lot of students get involved in doing oral histories. We had students creating or gathering information, doing historical documentation about the early development of schooling in that community, and they helped create a web page, and a lot of that information is now posted on a website. So it's really important to think about going into communities, and you could have a certain sense of what you think is important to a community, and then once you start discussing with the community, your objectives can change. And so again, it's important to think about how to work with communities rather than working on communities, and if you could have all of your collaborators on the same page, that makes for a very fruitful situation.
That in itself is a challenge, isn't it? To get everybody on the same page.
And it takes dialogue, and it takes patience, and sometimes it's not easy, and sometimes it takes more than a day, and sometimes it takes more than a week, and it takes patience to do that.
Yeah, I think I heard earlier today, maybe I heard you use the word messy or certainly interesting and full of complexity sometimes.
Life is complex, right? And it can get messy, and but it's a matter of whether you're willing to stick with it, to see it through. And a lot of times these situations could be very frustrating. And the thing is, are you willing to stick with it? And that's what it comes down to. Sometimes it's not worth sticking with it.
You have to make choices.
And people have to make choices.
Do you find your students get frustrated more quickly than you do, or are they?
Yeah, I think so. No. Yeah. Well, the older you get, I think the more patience you develop, because you realize things don't happen very quickly. And, just being in an academic institution, you learn that it takes a long time for curriculum development or just for anything to happen. And that's the same thing with life situations. You want change, and you want to see change happen quickly. But oftentimes it takes hard work to create change, and it takes persistence, and it takes time. And it's just not time, it's about working in that time to make that change. So, yeah.
Yeah. Thinking about collaborators both within the university and in communities that you work with, just talk a little bit about where you found real strengths in, or the particular kinds of organizations, or is there a lot of support across the university, and how do you develop that?
I think the strength that I find is with the outside communities and their desire for change. That's where most of my inspiration comes from. It's seeing people wanting change and working for change, and so if you're working with people who have that desire, it could make all the difference in the world. And that's that's the difference of whether it's worth working on a project or not, is do you have good collaborators outside and good collaborators within the community, and if you see the strength there to want change, it's worth, you know, working on a project. So that's where most of my inspiration comes from. It's from the outside, rather than the inside.
It's interesting hearing you describe your early experiences in archaeology. I think you had a really unique set of initial experiences that perhaps set you on this trajectory of seeing this kind of community-based work as not particularly unusual, whereas many people, I think, who begin archaeology wouldn't imagine that they would be doing the kind of work that you and many of our colleagues are doing today. And I don't know if that maybe it's so much internalized that it doesn't seem at all unusual.
Well, it doesn't seem unusual for me, but I do see the where people resist it, and I still see the resistance, and I think it's something that will take generations to change. It's not going to change in a year or several years or a decade or 2 decades. And we spoke earlier today that most people in our generation got into archaeology because they didn't have to talk to people, right?
Yeah.
And that's changed dramatically. And it changed with NAGPRA. We mentioned NAGPRA a little bit earlier today. It also changed with the African burial ground in New York City. And I see those two events as major events in public archaeology, where people had to consult with American Indians. And then the African burial ground, there's no law saying that you had to consult, but there was so much political pressure that people had to start thinking about community, and that was a watershed moment in American archaeology. So those, some people have learned, some haven't. So I think because we use those as examples, that the new generations of students and archaeologists coming in see that there's some value and some importance in collaboration at some level, at some levels, some more than others.
And the more successful projects or interesting or long-term projects, such as the ones you've worked on and you've described, they give great, strong examples to emulate, I think, among our younger colleagues.
Yeah, they're examples. They're examples of successes, but they're also examples of of failures rather. So, and I think I've tried really hard that when I write about these projects, that they're not just about success, but they're also about failure, and how do you deal with failure, and that's all part of community archaeology. Is that how do you deal with that, and how do you recover from that? And sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's not, but it's important things to consider. We see so many edited volumes come out that talk about the successes, but we don't see many volumes coming out that discuss the failures. And there probably are more failures than successes, but we tend to publish the successes. And I think we learn from failure, and that's what's important to think about, and how we move forward, and how do we lift ourselves up off the ground and move forward.
So shall we work on a volume that's well, and that's what scientists do, right? They talk about what didn't work and what did work, and
I think we need more of that.
Yes,
in
more
in
honesty.
Our discipline. Yes, more honesty.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah. Well, and that is encouraging to realize that even those who you see as, wow, they do wonderful work, not everything works as well as everything else, and so it's good to learn from those less successful experiences.
Yeah, they're learning experiences, and I think it's also important that our students realize too that there are failures, but you can learn from the failures as you move along in your graduate career and in your early professional career.
Speaking of early professional careers, do you see there are often barriers to younger colleagues as they're in the tenure track and so forth, to barriers to perhaps doing interdisciplinary work or community-based work, but do you see that changing? Do you see promising signs that the whole tenure structure and institutional structures are supportive of the kind of work that you do?
I see the institutional structures changing as far as interdisciplinary work, but I think what's important that we tell all our junior colleagues is that it's also important to figure out where you're going to publish that work. So transcripts and grade literature still doesn't count. But if you're publishing quality journals, that counts. And so community work, I don't think it gets rewarded as much as it should. Interdisciplinary work will increasingly be supported. And I think what we need to tell our junior colleagues is that if they're doing community work, they need to make sure that's in a forum in which the administrators see as appropriate, and people have to know that each institution is a little bit different, and they really need to figure out what those expectations are when they're going into tenure track positions.
And do you see a role for the professional organizations to help move that along or support that effort?
I think the organizations are trying to do that, but I don't see the universities listening to that. And I know there's been a movement over the past five years or so to do that, and I've received, maybe it's through the AAA, I've received information from AAA, one of the subgroups in AAA, and I've presented it to the dean, and related to applied work and community work, and his response was, well, that's service. That's not scholarship. And so that's a tough thing to overcome, and it might be a while before that actually changes. So they recognize it as beneficial, but they don't recognize it as far as publications or scholarship, and that's a tough hurdle.
Still work to be done in that area.
I think a lot of work to be done in that area.
Yeah. How about online publication or online presence? I know you make available online a lot of your reports and so forth. Do you have any sense of whether that's acknowledged or whether online journals, for example, are becoming more acceptable?
If they're peer reviewed. And so that's the big issue. So there's a movement towards online journals, and are the online journals peer reviewed? And if they are, in my institution, that carries some weight. But if they're not peer reviewed, it doesn't carry much weight. So I post a lot of information on the web, items that might be considered grade literature, documents, and site reports, and so forth, and that doesn't count for much, you know. But what it does do is it helps support the projects that I'm working on, and so it's all good information in the long run.
And it counts for in the communities because then that information is accessible to them, right?
Oh, big time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's important too.
Yeah.
Making our work accessible to the local communities is probably a major objective of our work, and I think it should be a major objective of all scholars' works.
Do you have a sense of another big project or another research area, either geographic or thematic, that you would like to tackle in the near future?
I haven't thought of that.
Okay.
You know? So I see so I'm working now in northeastern Pennsylvania, and I see myself there for the next couple of years. I think the issues are huge. There's a lot to tackle. There's a lot to think about how archaeology can fit into that area, and if we can use heritage to try to bond different groups to create a type of social capital where the different groups can actually find a place in the middle where they can meet, and I see it as a project that we're just beginning. Even though we've been there for about 5 years working on this, I still think we have a long ways to go, and every year there's new opportunities, or there's different groups to incorporate into our larger program, and so every year it's exciting. There's new things to do, and there's new communities to reach out to, and new organizations to work with. So I think at the moment I'm there in northeastern Pennsylvania for the foreseeable future.
Okay, and you, of course, you have new students coming in as well, and you have some. Are undergraduates as well as graduate students working with you in that?
There's
project?
undergraduates and graduate students. I just had my first graduate student get his PhD on materials from northeastern Pennsylvania, and I have another one in the wings. So it's really a lot of fun and gratifying to see that this is becoming a major part of their research design and their research projects, working with communities, and that some of them will actually eventually be teaching students in the future about how to do archaeology, and probably something better and different, in the future, and that's okay. But it's really nice to see students working on this, benefiting from it, and really think about issues of immigration and social justice, and incorporating those issues into their research, and that's important to me.
And undergraduates as well.
And undergraduates are very much a part of the program, and they work on, not only do the field school, but they end up working on the project during the school year. They're working on census data. They're working on issues of race and ethnicity, the composition of the towns and how they were composed and how they changed over time. The students are very engaged in dialogues related to race and racism, and how it changes over time, and thinking about how different ethnic groups were discriminated over time. So we have a lot of different levels of engagement for undergraduates and graduate students.
So those dialogues take place on campus and then in the community as well, or?
Yeah. So we are in the community. One of the things that we did was I was sitting at the dining room table, and I opened up the newspaper, and there was an ad in the paper about how the community wanted to take their city back, because they felt like there were so many Latinos coming into Hazleton. They wanted to do something about it, so they had a community meeting, and it was a tea party meeting at a local a local restaurant, and there were about 120 people there, and they had discussions about taking the community back. They talked about the new immigrant community and how they didn't want them there, and how they were afraid of them, and they used a lot of code words for hate, and so our students were part of that, well, they viewed that discussion, and it became a real learning and teaching moment for the students who were students of different nationalities and different ethnic backgrounds. And then that evening we went back to the house and we had some interesting dialogues about race in the community, and how racism takes all different forms, and the language and the code words for hate, and so it's an interesting project, and it's an interesting place, and there's a lot of different avenues to expose students to some of this really tough language and these tough situations, and how to deal with it and how to cope with it and how to understand it.
Mm. And it was probably particularly jarring for them, as you described earlier. The house you were using as your base for the field school was in the immigrant community, and you were having lots of wonderful interactions with them, and that was the community that was being talked about in those ways. So it must have been quite educational and challenging for your students and for you, I would think.
Well, yeah. So we do live in the Latino community, and we've done that for the past 4 or 5 years. Lived in the Latino community, and we visit the stores in the Latino community, and we visit the food markets in the Latino community, and the restaurants, and we're greeted with open arms and smiles, and we talk to the merchants, how do you cook these plantains? And the person of Dominican descent will tell us one way, and the person of Puerto Rican descent will tell us a different way, and then we have these lively discussions about how to cook plantains, and so they're really, it's a really interesting living situation where we do have good relations with the community, and then for the students to hear the hate, it's kind of disturbing to see and to experience. Yeah. All
part of their education in archaeology and heritage today, right?
Yeah, it's a great experience, I think. Yeah.
Well, I must say your students are incredibly fortunate to have this kind of exposure to communities and to working with communities, and I'm really excited to hear your talk tonight about New Philadelphia. Sorry about you. We did that one. Yeah. About the Northeast Pennsylvania. And I want to thank you very much for talking with me. We could talk for hours, but I know you need to get ready for this evening. So
okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.